morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us for this very special program today. And thank you to all of our members and viewers for your ongoing support. To ask questions today, there's a control panel on your right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions for Professor Summers. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, a conversation with Professor Lawrence Summers, Economic Recovery for a Post-Pandemic Nation. Dr. Lawrence Summers is the former Treasury Secretary and Harvard President Emeritus. Bill Dolan is our moderator today. He's a Senior Vice President at US Bank in charge of private wealth management. And a big thank you to US Bank, who is a sponsor of today's program. Without further ado, Bill and Professor Summers, it's time to bring you on for this very important conversation.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for that. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Dolan, Managing Director of Investments for US Bank Private Wealth Management. On behalf of the Council and US Bank, I want to welcome everybody. It's an important discussion today in advance of tomorrow's election. I also want to say a couple of quick thank yous to Hans Getty on the board at the Council and also our commercial bank manager here in Los Angeles, Rudy Medina, our Southern California president of the commercial bank, and John Cinnamon, who heads up private wealth management for US Bank in California. Thanks to everybody. And thank you, Dr. Summers, for joining us today. Really looking forward to this. I want to focus on two primary themes and then how those themes connect to our economy and more importantly, how they connect to people's lives. And that's COVID-19 and the election coming up tomorrow. So there's been tremendous response, fiscal response, monetary response coming in central bank and our government for this pandemic. And there's implications to those things. And so again, I want to focus on those issues, what we've seen so far, what we expect in the future, kind of some of the challenges around that, how that ties into debt, deficit, taxes, employment, and so forth. So with that, I want to start with the response that we've seen so far, and then what you think we need going forward, both from stimulus, continued unemployment package, and monetary policy, Jerome Powell, and the policies that we've seen so far. So Dr. Summers, to you.
Bill, thank you for that question, which I'll come to in a moment. Thank you for the invitation to return to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I enjoyed my previous session, which was in person and in better weather than where I am right now in Boston. And I really think the kind of civil, thoughtful dialogue on crucial issues for which your organization stands is something that's immensely important at a juncture like the present one in the United States. Look, I think relative to what one might have expected last April, the health consequences of COVID have been and look to be much grimmer than one feared. I think the chance that we are substantially less than halfway through the mortality consequences from COVID or the disease burden from COVID is pretty low. So at this point, to be only halfway through is really tragic. And I think as we'll get to, that reflects many policy failures as well as the inherent difficulty of the disease. I think, Bill, that the economy has recovered somewhat more rapidly than many would have expected, especially given the seriousness of the problem on the health side. And I think that's a reflection of the aggressiveness of policy. Above all, the aggressiveness of fiscal policy. Usually in recessions, disposable income, household incomes in toto go down as people lose their jobs and get less income. The full suite of measures that was enacted with the CARES Act meant that in the second and third quarters, disposable income didn't go down, unlike any previous recession. And that enabled the maintenance of consumer spending. That consumer spending plus direct government spending has enabled the economy to still suffer the worst downturn since the Depression, but to recover more rapidly than many expected. I don't think there is any reason at all to find it plausible that with the pandemic at its gravest level, and with the effects of the initial stimulus wearing off, and without the provision of substantial new stimulus, that we are going to avoid very, very poor economic performance. In addition to the fact that incomes will stop being supported, there are a range of other complexities. Gathering storms in the rest of the world that will affect our exports, potential problems in significant parts of the housing market when mortgage relief programs end, growing strains in rental markets, both on the housing, in household and commercial side, as rent moratoriums run out of time, eviction moratoriums run out of time, and landlords run into more difficulty meeting their obligations to financial institutions. So it seems to me that without substantial further fiscal action, we are looking at a potentially very serious situation with a very real possibility of a double dip back into recession.
Right. So I think that ties into, at least in a lot of people's minds, the next administration. What's going to happen? You know, I've heard discussions of a $5 trillion package should we see a blue wave. And then, of course, that has implications on the deficit and ultimately the national debt we have. What are your views on potential outcomes with this election tomorrow, and specifically as it relates to bridging this gap until vaccine or effective vaccine is distributed, or true therapeutics that render a virus less dangerous?
So my brain and my heart are telling me the same thing, that it's much more likely that we will have a change in administration than not. And certainly on the strength of the economic policies of the last 4 years and the COVID policies of the last year, I think the country will be well served by a change in administration. I think the same thing about the nature of our national sense of community and our international relations in the world, that a return to normality rather than government by tweet will, I think, provide some very substantial benefits. On the economic side, I think there's much more risk that we will do too little to support economic growth going forward than there is that we will do too much. And this goes back to the set of economic arguments around the phrase secular stagnation that I've been making for some years now. The concept of secular stagnation goes back to the Harvard economist Alvin Hansen, who coined the term in the 1930s. What he had in mind was a situation where private savings was in chronic excess of private investment. And we've certainly seen many factors that have increased private savings, more uncertainty, more of the income going to the wealthy. And we've seen many factors that have reduced investment. The fact that the labor force is no longer growing at a substantial rate, the fact that capital goods in information technology cost 100-fold less than they did decades ago. Think about my cell phone versus a Cray supercomputer. The fact that the economy is undergoing a general demassification. Think about the end of malls. Think about how much less space a law firm needs than it used to because it doesn't have to have filing cabinets anymore. All of this leads to an excess of saving over investment. That's the reason why interest rates are zero, not just right now during the current downturn, but interest rates looking out are at extraordinarily low levels. Real interest rates, as you infer them from the index bond market, are negative going out for a very, very long period of time, and they're even lower in Europe than they are in the United States. In that situation, the risks of too much demand seem to me to be very small compared to the risks of too little demand. And I hope we'll get as much fiscal stimulus as possible. If the fiscal stimulus is heavily directed to prudent investments, investments that expand the productivity of the economy, investments that prepare children for lives in the workforce rather than on welfare, those investments may even pay for themselves ultimately in a present value sense, given the very low level of interest rates. So I certainly hope that we will embark on a multi-trillion-dollar economic renewal program, and that we will do so as rapidly as possible.
I think some of those concepts you're discussing too tie into artificial intelligence, automation, machine learning, and what happens to jobs going forward. But I want to stay connected here to this stimulus package for a minute and ask you your thoughts on what would you say is the most important part of that. I mean, the unemployment assistance, the Main Street lending program, the PPP program. Should we be supporting state and local governments as well? What would you say would be going forward, the most important aspects of whatever that package may be?
I think it's madness that we have not supported state and local governments more extensively to date. The federal government has better credit than they do. If this isn't the time to extend the benefits of that better credit to state and local governments, when would such a time be? Can this possibly be a moment when it makes sense to be scaling back municipal hospitals, closing down and reducing the hiring of guidance counselors in schools at a moment when kids are having unprecedented difficulty? So I think we surely should be providing much more support for state and local governments. I think there's room for a prudent path forward. I'm sympathetic with the concerns that too many people found themselves getting a raise when they got laid off because of the $600 benefit. I think you ought to get more for working than you do for not working. But I certainly think that the existing unemployment insurance system needs to be substantially supplemented. But the two things that I actually think are most important to include in Recovery Act are substantial appropriations for very substantially upgraded testing and contact tracing, and beginning a broader set of public investments in American renewal, which from my perspective should start with our infrastructure. With respect to infrastructure, the examples abound. I've been flying from Logan Airport in Boston to National Airport in Washington to give whatever wisdom Harvard has to the government for more than 40 years now. When I started doing that, it took an hour and a quarter. Now it takes an hour and 45 minutes. I don't think airplane engine technology has regressed. I don't think the locations of the airports have changed. We just haven't managed an air traffic control system and an aviation infrastructure that has kept up. You can say the same thing about potholes in roads. You can say the same thing about water systems where kids drink lead and lose some of their natural brain power. You can say the same thing about where we stand on broadband access at a moment when, God knows, with COVID, that's becoming especially important relative to other countries. Seems to me a major investment in our infrastructure is absolutely essential at a moment like this.
What would you say to those that are concerned that that type of investment or that type of spending, in addition to a deficit already that's approaching $1 trillion this year, over 900 billion, adding to that national debt, at what point, is that I don't want to say sustainable, but at what point does that become really problematic? So, for example, with our creditors, where we can't then finance that deficit going forward, or really with our own economy. And I've read some of your analysis on this, and just like to get some of your thoughts and tying in this, need to spend to keep us going during this crisis or pandemic, with this idea that we're just taking on too much, and at some point it's going to be crushing.
Bill, I think that the first principle of debt for me as a household, for a prudent business, or for the federal government, you can't say what the right amount of debt is unless you know what you're putting on the asset side of the balance sheet. And that it's malpractice to turn away opportunities to borrow at 1% and earn a 5% return or a 10% return. It hurts a company's shareholders if their managements do that. A family that never buys a home and pays 6% of the value of the house every year in rent is engaged in financial malpractice, the consequence of which is to leave it less well prepared for its retirement. And a government that forgoes high return investments because of fear of debt is making an equivalent mistake. So could I imagine borrowing programs for purposes that wouldn't be effectively served, that would be right to oppose? Yes, of course I can. But is the idea that is so popular that you should make a judgment about a debt to income ratio really a good way of thinking about where prudence starts? I don't think so. Another way to put the point, go back to the household analogy. When I came to Harvard almost 40 years ago, Harvard recruited me in part by offering something that was very valuable to me at the time, a 9% interest mortgage. At that time, the level of mortgage debt that people could take relative to their incomes was much less than it is today, when interest rates are much lower. Similarly, the interest burden that the federal government is bearing right now relative to GDP is lower than it's been through most of our history. Surely what we should be looking at is something like that interest burden. So is there a limit at some point? Yes. Is it ever a good idea to borrow wastefully? No. But is the principal thing holding back the American economy that we have extra debt at a 1% interest rate in a currency that we print ourselves for the long term? No, that is not the principal thing holding back the American economy. And every time we borrow money at 1%, and we invest it in a way that earns much more than 1%, we become richer and more creditworthy, not less creditworthy.
Thank you. That's helpful. I guess that also can tie into some of our constituents' questions about taxes, and again, getting back to this election and potentially what we can expect going forward. So we're thinking about the national debt, reducing the debt, either with less spending or increased taxes or some iteration of those two things. You articulated your view on taking on that cheap debt and reinvesting in higher returning ways, and I think that makes perfect sense. But will our debt become more expensive? Should we see inflationary pressures? And so let's talk a little bit about maybe this notion of 2% average inflation target versus a 2% target. I recall economist Woodford out of Columbia talking a couple of years ago about a GDP average versus a GDP target. Maybe you could just discuss this notion of where we're trying to get with our growth in the economy and inflation, and as that ties into, again, these ideas of very inexpensive presently our debt service, so that dollar spend on debt service isn't so much than it used to be, even though the debt is much higher because of those low interest rates. And then the potential for change in tax law going forward with a Biden win, with a Biden or blue wave versus kind of status quo where we are now.
Bill, look, I don't think these questions about the inflation target or the nominal GDP target or the average inflation target or the ceiling on inflation, in all honesty, I think it's of very, very little importance right now. And the reason it's of very little importance right now is it's like my discussing whether I should lose 30 pounds or 50 pounds. Starting from where I am, it's pretty obvious which way we want to move things. Where we are right now is the interest rate's basically zero. Where we are right now is the market expects it to be very, very close to zero for a very long time. I do not believe there's any business anywhere in America that is saying to itself, we've got an 83 basis point 10-year treasury, so I'm not investing. But if only we could get the treasury rate for 10 years down to 40 basis points, then I would invest. So I don't believe that the scope that the Fed has for further economic stimulus is very great. Yes, if we have another financial panic, the Fed can serve as a lender of last resort, and that would prevent a collapse. Yes, if the Fed wanted to send us back into recession by jacking up rates, they could do it. But I think the old phrase, pushing on a string, captures the essence of the problem right now, and the details of the monetary framework, I don't think matter very much. In general, I think sending signals that are more on the side of expansion is good, but I think there's much less than meets the eye in all these discussions of Fed frameworks. All you really need to know is that the interest rate is near zero and expected to be near zero for a long time. And the Fed has done its job. And the question's now going to go to a range of fiscal and structural policies as to whether we're going to have another glacially slow recovery or not. You also asked about taxes. Let me say a little bit about that. Unlike on the question of monetary policy, where I think economics is kind of a science and there's things we understand, and I just gave you what my understanding was, no conversation about taxes doesn't depend on your values as to what's fair in terms of distributing a burden. But here, and I'm going to speak from my values, but somebody else could have different values, and it wouldn't be right for me to say those were wrong, that those were the wrong values. I think the place to begin a conversation with taxes is with the observation that on current trends, we will fail to collect $7 trillion of taxes that are owed but not paid over the next decade. That the largest part of that will come from taxpayers towards the very top of the income distribution. And that the IRS enforcement effort, if you look at the audit rate, if you look at the quality of the computer technology, if you look at the nature of information reporting, has basically been drastically cut over the years. We are only auditing about half as high a fraction of millionaire tax returns as we were 10 years ago. And the highest audit rates in the country are in some of the poorest townships in Mississippi, relative to any other geography. And I just can't see why that should be so. I've laid out with others, my colleague Natasha Sarin, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, Charles Rosati, who served as the IRS commissioner during my time as Treasury Secretary, a comprehensive program that would raise well over $1 trillion over the next decade, and in addition would reduce the incentive for all kinds of sheltering activity. I think that's the right thing to do. I find it hard to see why we shouldn't do that in order to raise revenue. I think that it's kind of odd at best that we have a corporate tax rate now in America, 21%, that's lower than the one the Business Roundtable was asking for when the tax reform debate began. And we have a similar set of provisions through so-called pass-through entities, some of which are tax shelters that are ways of avoiding even that low corporate tax rate. And I wouldn't support raising the corporate tax rate to 35% where it used to be. I wouldn't support raising it to 30% where, as some would suggest. But taking it from 21 to somewhere in the 25 to 28 range, closing the various shelters that were opened up, that seems to me to be something almost all economists should be prepared to support. There are a range of other provisions that go at various kinds of shelters that I think there's a strong case for addressing. I've never really understood why, if Bill Gates gets his Microsoft stock becomes worth over $100 billion. He gives that Microsoft stock to his child, and his child sells that Microsoft stock. There should be no capital gains tax. Those are examples of provisions that I think should be fixed and would be very valuable to fix.
Yeah, I think we've seen that proposal in Biden's tax plan for doing away with the step-up basis. At this point, I want to pass it back to Jessica with the World Council. I know there's a lot of questions out there from people who are participating here. So Jessica, to you.
Great, thank you so much, Bill, and thank you,
Great.
Professor Summers.
I'll try to give brief answers so we can get through as many as possible.
Thank you so much. The first question. Since the majority of office workers are working from home, how are companies' landlords meeting their lease obligations?
With difficulty in many cases, but part of the answer is that if your offices are empty, but your people are working at home and technology is letting them work as effectively as they were when they were in the office, then you're still going to be able to generate a lot of revenue, and you're still going to be able to afford to meet your lease obligation. That argument applies actually pretty well to a lot of office workers. I don't think it applies nearly as well to a variety of retail establishments, restaurants, and the like. And I suspect we're headed for more trouble around commercial real estate before too long.
Thank you. How do you see international trade agreements shifting to be more responsive in the future to global events like COVID-19?
I'm not sure there's so much you can do with respect to trade agreements on COVID. Trade agreements tend to have a pretty long tether and work out over quite a number of years. And so they're not a kind of rapid response strategy. I think there have been some excesses in the past on socially vital medicines being sold at high prices because trade agreements included intellectual property protection, even in ways that caused AIDS medicines in Africa to be sold at very high prices. And I think there's some movement away from that kind of thing. And I actually think that's probably a good thing in the context of trade diplomacy.
Thank you. When the government sends stimulus packages to the states in the trillions, are the funds being borrowed, or is money just being printed by the Treasury?
Basically, the way to think about it is that the money's being borrowed. That whether directly or indirectly, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially the money is always borrowed to finance government spending, and then the question of how much money is going to be printed versus how much bonds are going to be outstanding is left to the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. Can you put the government spending on COVID in context? Is it like World War II spending or more like the 2008 financial crisis?
The total level of the budget deficit that the government was running in the second quarter of 2020 was getting up closer to the World War II level than to the COVID level. I would be than to the 2008 level. I would be very surprised when all's said and done if the magnitude of the debt we incur associated with COVID will be as large as the debt we incurred associated with the Second World War relative to the size of the economy, just because we were on a wartime footing for close to 4 years. And I wouldn't expect anything like that with respect to COVID.
Thank you. Which do you consider more important, a healthy economy or a healthy population? To me, the stock market is not an indication of a healthy economy.
Well, I certainly would agree with you that a strong stock market does not necessarily mean a strong economy. Part of the secular stagnation theory that I talked about earlier emphasized the idea that when you've got a lot of savings and not much investment opportunity, the savings all flows into the existing assets, and that bids them up for the beneficiary of the wealthy minority that holds them, rather than benefiting the economy as a whole. So I certainly would agree that the stock market's not the right measure of the economy's overall health. I'm not sure that I can quite answer a question, which is more important, a healthy economy or a healthy population. I like to think that in a whole variety of ways they go together. People who are enabled to work productively and have high incomes usually turn out to be healthier than people who are unemployed for sustained periods of time. A healthier population tends to be a more productive population, and so contribute to better economic performance. So it seems to me that we can't choose between those two vital national objectives. They've both got to be important. And it seems to me that they're symbiotic, that if we do a good job of promoting inclusive prosperity, that will tend to show up as better health statistics. And if we do a good job of promoting our health, I think that will contribute to a stronger economy.
Thank you. Despite the immediate need for fiscal and monetary stimulus, can the U.S. afford a growing deficit, growing over $1 trillion a year, and virtually zero interest rates with no appreciable investment, i.e. infrastructure or education?
I think I answered that to a substantial extent when Bill put that question. The main themes in my answer were, yes, we can afford to borrow if we invest wisely. And we have huge investment gaps in the areas your questioner emphasizes around infrastructure and education.
Thank you. Do you think a guaranteed income makes sense?
Probably not. I think the issues that it raises are of two kinds. One, there's just a question of expense. That if you're trying to guarantee something to everybody, 330 million times anything is a lot. And so suppose you wanted to give everybody $20,000 a year. You're looking at something that's almost twice the size of the federal budget. Even if you wanted to give everybody only $10,000 a year, you're looking at something that's comparable, actually somewhat larger than the federal budget. And I don't think we have the wherewithal to double all taxes or to borrow on anything like that kind of scale. I also think there's a basic fairness problem. Do we want to pay people well for not working? Do we, if you have a guaranteed income, that means that my kid, the year he graduates from college, can take his guaranteed income and do whatever it is he wants to do, rather than go and get a job. I would rather see us have more targeted assistance that is targeted at helping people move to work and is targeted helping people who are unable to work, rather than simply making incomes available on a universal basis to everyone, no questions asked. I think that substantial transfers with dependency on the government should come with questions.
Thank you so much. The 2008 crisis disproportionately hurt the most economically disadvantaged. The current recession from the pandemic seems to be repeating, doing the same. What economic policies are necessary in a recession to avoid this, if any?
I think the most important thing we can do is actually prevent recessions. And I actually think the reality of the situation is that it's very hard to have recessions that don't hurt the insecure more than the secure. Some of that is because if everybody's income goes down by 20%, that's going to hurt people who are less well off more than it's going to hurt Bill Gates or people who are more well off. Some of that's because it's just the way businesses behave, that the people who are most marginally hired are likely to be the people who are first fired. So I don't think we're going to be able to completely avoid that. I think what we do need is generous, aggressive unemployment insurance. We need substantially stepped up efforts at employer retraining, which is an area where the United States has traditionally lagged. And I think we need to do much more in terms of regionally oriented policies to help the parts of the country where there's the most chronic joblessness. And we should be working at targeting our stimulus more to the places that are overcooled than to the places that are overheated.
Thank you. This is a longer question. Interest rates have constantly and generally consistently dropped since the 80s, while asset prices have continued to rise in value. Now that we have hit the bottom of interest rates twice-ish, how will we be able to ensure asset prices continue to rise? And do we not worry about a dramatic drop in asset prices once rates start going back up, like we saw the brief scare in 2018, I believe? And then therefore, the Fed never being the adult in the room and truly raising rates to allow the low income to afford housing and savers to earn interest.
I think that your questioner gets at exactly the secular stagnation theme that I've been discussing. I don't think that interest rates are low fundamentally because the Fed's been lowering them. I think interest rates are low because savings have been high, investment has been low, and the Fed's been trying to conduct a monetary policy that will avoid deflation and keep us relatively fully employed. And that's meant that it has followed the underlying reality and set interest rates at low levels. And yes, as I explained before, I think that has been a substantial contributor to increases in asset prices and to a relatively high ratio of wealth to income. I don't think the kind of stock market performance we have had since the kind of stock market performance that we've had since the 2008 recession is remotely sustainable for another decade. The S&P 500 at one point was down near 700. It's well above 3,000 today. I don't think there's any appreciable chance that we're going to see a 4x return on the S&P, even leaving aside dividends over the next decade. And it's precisely because I don't think the decline in interest rates that we've seen, we're now kind of in the basement and you can't jump very far out the basement window, is going to be sustainable. Whether there'll be a big decline, whether interest rates will rise, that's a judgment that every investor has to make for themselves. I think I tend to believe that because the fundamental forces that determine interest rates have operated so strongly to bring them down, that I probably see a less rapid increase in interest rates in the future than your questioner does. But look, the adjustment has not taken place in expectations around portfolio returns. And the kind of expectation that's maintained with respect to state public employee retiree funds, or that's maintained by university endowments, that inflation's going to be 2 or 3 and real returns are going to be 5, and so they're going to earn 7 or 8% a year. It could happen, but it doesn't strike me as being a best guess or a reasonable best guess for the next decade.
Thank you. And as a bit of a follow-up to a comment you just made, should federal aid to states and municipalities be coupled with pension reform?
I think there's a complicated set of questions in the state pension area, and I don't know as much about them as I'd like to. I think there is going to need to be reform in those areas. I think that there's a problem, and the problem is that from the point of view of political officials, hiring people with promises of retirement benefits after they've retired, after the politician's long gone, is highly tempting. On the other hand, people really did take those jobs in reliance on those promises, and they wouldn't have taken those jobs at the salaries they were offered if they weren't offered very generous retirement benefits. And so there aren't any heroes in this. This issue is sometimes presented in terms of these egregious pensions going to these public employees. And sure, there's some corruption of various kinds, but the main problem is that people who can't afford to pay on a contemporary basis what it costs to attract good teachers, to attract people to do the dangerous work of being a cop or a fireman, have done it with promises. Well, it's not that unreasonable for the people who went to work on those bases and did some of the most important work of our society to keep those expect those promises to be kept. So I think it's going to be a very challenging thing to work our way through, But at a minimum, the first rule of holes is stop digging. And I think we need to be very careful about hiring people with promised pensions that are beyond what we can afford.
That sounds wise. The stock market has performed fairly well during President Trump's time and has also performed relatively well during COVID. Do you credit this performance to specific policy measures instituted by the Trump administration? What advice do you have to the next president to keep the markets performing as strongly as possible?
Well, first, if you raise taxes on everybody else now and in the future in order to finance a corporate tax cut, then corporate profits will go up and the stock market will go up too. But that doesn't particularly mean you've done anything that's good for the economy and for the society. If you gut environmental regulation, then it will help the stock market value of some companies that pollute. If you allow banks to go back to pursuing policies in lending that mislead customers into taking out loans that are bad for the customers and good for the banks, then you will see some increase in the profitability of banks, and that will show up in the stock market. So I think it's a very great misconception to suppose that the performance of the stock market provides a basis for evaluating the overall quality of economic policy. And certainly keeping the stock market up or making the stock market grow more strikes me as a very odd objective for economic policy in a country where the vast majority of the stocks are owned by a small percentage of the population, and that small percentage of the population in income terms is pulled away from everybody else. If you look at stock markets around the world, they've been pretty strong. So I think it's a mistake also to assume that it's only the president's policies that drive the stock market. There's a great deal about how innovative companies have been, how the nature of markets has changed. I think, ironically, that a lot of what's driven the stock market up is what you referred to, Jessica, in your previous question. It's the dearth of investment opportunity that's leading savings to go into existing assets. So I don't think of that as a model that we would want to be seeing as a good one to continue over the next 4 years. I would much rather see us emphasize making fundamental investments in a stronger economy that will help all Americans.
Thank you. What are your views regarding the inclusion of private parties in traditional government infrastructure projects through P3s, economic development zone projects, etc.?
I'm sympathetic, and the devil's in the details. It's always struck me as ironic and probably wrong that in capitalist America, almost all the airports are publicly owned. And in Europe, which is thought of as much more to the left than the United States, almost all the airports are privately owned. And so I think there's a lot of room for innovation in terms of bringing the private sector in more to infrastructure. It's a way of mobilizing capital. And I actually think the more important issue is that in some contexts, it's a way of mobilizing competence, where things will be managed better than the public sector is likely to manage them. On the other hand, I think one has to look at the deals very, very carefully, because sometimes the private sector, in return for providing a bunch of cash in the short run that appeals to some myopic government official, is actually getting some stream of returns that's way excessive. So making sure that it's properly competitive, properly monitored, and properly evaluated, I think is very, very important.
Thank you. What should the priorities and amounts of infrastructure spending be under a Biden administration?
I don't think there's much risk of doing too much. I've heard the number $2 trillion for green projects plus infrastructure. That doesn't seem to me to be a bad place to start the discussion. I think it's important to remember with respect to infrastructure that it's mostly now or later. It's not like you're going to never repair the airport. Don't you think if LaGuardia Airport had been repaired 15 years earlier, we would have had a better airport for the last 15 years? We would have done the repair at a time when there would have been fewer people flying, and so there would have been less disruption. It would have been cheaper because of the intervening construction inflation than it's going to be now. So I think there is this idea that deferring infrastructure somehow saves money, and I think it's more wrong than right.
Yeah, I was actually talking to my mom about that. Sometimes we're living in the ruins of our ancestors, and we aren't necessarily thinking about the next generation as well, and what they're going to have to deal with. So yeah, exactly your points. Invest now so you can enjoy it as well as future generations. This will be my final question because I know you have a hard out, and then I'll turn it back over to Bill. Are high tax states, California, New York, New Jersey, reaching a ceiling on their personal income tax rates on its highest earners?
I suspect so. I think that mobility places a constraint. I've been relatively fortunate in life, but I'm a college professor who's worked in the government, so I'm hardly a plutocrat. I consulted with an estate planning lawyer in Massachusetts, which is not as high tax a state as California or New York, although it does have a colder climate. And I asked him what fraction of his well-to-do clients at some point left Massachusetts for tax reasons, including the Massachusetts estate tax. And he said he thought his clients were typical of well-to-do people in the Boston area. And he thought somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of them left at some point.
Wow.
Well, if that's close to true, it suggests that there's not a lot of room for big increases that raise very much revenue. And I actually think this issue of competition is a reason why over time we're probably going to have to federalize a larger fraction of core public activity, because while I think migration out of a high tax state like California is a plausible option for many people, I don't think migration out of the United States is a plausible option for nearly as many people. And constitutionally, when the issue is the United States, we can tax people in a penal way when they leave, which is not something that is nearly as possible at the state level.
Thank you so much, Professor Summers. I hope you'll come back out to Southern California and see us. We'll keep the weather nice, and hopefully we can do this again in person.
I hope my next visit to your World Affairs Council will not be a virtual visit, and it has been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be with you, Jessica, and you, Bill, and to participate in this dialogue. And whatever each of our own political preferences may be, I think we can all join in a hope that our election will be resolved fairly, clearly, quickly, and in a way that causes the American project to move forward strongly in the years ahead.
I agree. Thank you. Bill, I'll turn this back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Summers. Really appreciate the insights, the information. It's, all the participants today and everybody who's paying attention to what's going on in the world. It's so important to have that context. So again, thank you for being with us today. And for all the participants, great questions, great dialogue. Echo Professor Summers' sentiment, and look forward to speaking with you, our clients, and others in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Summers. Bill, thank you so much for moderating. A big thank you to US Bank for sponsoring today's program, and we can't wait to have you back, Professor, as soon as it's safe. Everybody, we have a special election series tomorrow with Professor Dan Schnur, so please stay tuned. And then on Thursday, California Attorney General Xavier Becerra will be discussing protecting California values and preparing for the future. So please join us. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you both so very much.